Thank you for joining Political Research Associates today for our first discussion in a series of the rights steady capture of the center. Today we will be reflecting on right-wing organizing against comprehensive sex education in our contemporary post-Roe era. For those of you who are new to PRA or Political Research Associates, we are a social justice research and strategy center dedicated to blocking the advance of oppressive, anti-democratic movements and to building a just and inclusive democratic society. Over the past 4 decades, PRA has researched, monitored, and publicized the agenda and strategies of the U.S. and global right, revealing the powerful intersections of Christian nationalism, white nationalism, and patriarchy. PRA produces investigative reports, articles, and tools, publishes the peer-reviewed magazine The Public Eye, advises social justice movement organizers, and offers expert commentary for local and national media outlets. Our core issue areas span reproductive justice, LGBTQ rights, racial and immigrant justice, civil liberties, and economic justice. On the precipice of our new 5-year strategic plan, we are entering a period of increased investment in growing our organization and achieving our vision. We're really excited to dig deep with our partners, contribute more fully in national conversations, and help sustain and grow the left's social justice movement in this critical moment. We invite you, both on a panel and in our audience today, to think about getting involved with PRA. Write for us, connect your organization to ours, and join us in our work. Our webinars are just one way to engage with PRA. That said, we are deeply grateful to you, our audience, for joining us, and we are particularly grateful to be joined by 3 incredible thinkers, advocates, and practitioners working in reproductive justice when this work is more important than ever. We are honored to be joined by Amy Littlefield, abortion access correspondent for The Nation, Cecilia Espinoza, the Associate Director of Access at IPES, and Jacqueline Friedman, a writer, educator, and activist, and the founder and executive director of Educate Us, SCOTUS in Action, which is an advocacy organization working to build a national movement of sex ed voters. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists and to you, our wonderful audience, for joining us today. Please note the webinar will be recorded, and the recording along with a transcript will be distributed by email and on our website in the next few days. Audience members, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat so we can see who all is with us. We encourage you to use the chat to engage in the conversation, and also expect the chat to remain free from rhetoric that may be harmful to our panelists and attendees. With housekeeping notes out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to get started by taking stock of our current moment. When we describe the socio-political, I'm just hearing now our chat is disabled. That is a leftover from our more controversial previous webinar. Apologies, please feel free to use the Q&A function for questions. And we will connect in our next webinar with you all. As I was saying, today when we are describing the socio-political context of contemporary reproductive rights and healthcare in America, what do we mean when we say post-Roe? What is the status quo of sex education in the U.S. and the fight on the left to establish universal comprehensive sex ed, or CSE? Then we'll transition to a discussion of where the Christian right is focused in the aftermath of Roe, both in terms of abortion and CSE access, and how these struggles over reproductive rights relate to the culture wars being fought in our schools, thinking about CRT, anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans advocacy, separation of church and state. We have a big conversation ahead of us, so I'm going to start us off with our first question, which is a broad one. But at a glance, in the wake of Roe being overturned, how has the landscape of anti-abortion advocacy shifted? Where are the major arenas of struggle now and moving forward? I would like to start with you, Amy, as someone who's covered abortion significantly over the last few years. Your audio is not coming through. Is anybody else having that experience? Yeah. Despite being unmuted. We're going to give you a minute, and I'll start with you, Cecilia.
Hear now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Amy.
Okay.
Oh, no, it's gone again. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. I'm going to give you a few minutes. Cecilia, do you want to take us away with this answer?
Yeah, thank you, Coffee, and thank you, everyone. First, I just want to acknowledge that my colleague Paige Logan was invited to this panel, so I'm honored to be here in representation of her and her work, also around like comprehensive sexuality education and obviously abortion advocacy. But basically, as I mentioned, this is a very broad question because there's different elements that influence this. But I think that I don't think that necessarily the landscape have a shift or change. I just think it's like it has like basically give the anti-choice movement, like a platform beyond like their traditional audiences. I think that the change of this, that happened with the SCOTUS decision is also basically offering like a precedent to other countries on, it's like how rights that have been, in existence for many years can be, eliminated. So, it's like definitely something that we have to take into account as, as we work in the broader movement. I think that there's different like specific issues in the US that we need to definitely pay attention. But right now, I think like the main battle, it's at the state level, because obviously the different organization, activist movements are trying to preserve the services that are still available, especially, like the midterm elections are definitely constituting a challenge in many states, including in North Carolina, where I'm based, where we can see, we are having a lot of concerns about like what it will happen in the 2023 legislators. So, I think that the anti-rights movement is basically very empowered on like the progress that they have done on their side in the United States, and they're basically learning from each other in across states. And so it requires a very coordinated and strong resistance from like organizations in the RJ movement in general.
Thank you, Cecilia. I really appreciate you bringing also the international lens in right at the beginning of our discussion, and also sort of the midterms. I think are on all our minds at the moment. Amy, let's test your audio.
Am I here now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hooray! I've been silenced by AirPods. I apologize.
No problem.
So thanks so much for including me in this conversation. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that the end goal of the anti-abortion movement for half a century or more has always been fetal personhood, has always been enshrining the rights of the fetus either into the Constitution through a constitutional amendment or through a nationwide ban. I mean, we got a hint of that this week when Lindsey Graham went ahead and said the quiet part out loud and introduced a 15-week abortion ban, even though, of course, the anti-abortion movement has been disingenuously claiming that they're returning the issue to the states. And so even though that's the end goal, I think we're going to continue to see that the strategy is incrementalism, and that the battleground when it comes to abortion access and all of the other issues you were talking about, whether it's trans rights, sex education, it's going to be in the states, in the cities, and in the counties. It's going to be local. And the reason for that, one reason for that, right, is that the anti-abortion movement understands that the majority of people support legal abortion. the majority of people, I mean, I haven't examined the polling as much on some of the other issues we're talking about, but I would imagine when it comes to sex ed too, right? The majority does not have an extreme position against sexual education, right? And so the question for the anti-abortion movement has always been about how to circumvent the democratic process. And they have been very successful in doing that at the state level, at the city level, using a combination of gerrymandering and voter suppression, and the assumption that, especially when it comes to school board meetings and city council meetings and state legislatures, there aren't a whole lot of people watching. And so, you know, if people don't know something's coming up for discussion, or they don't know that there's an election, which again is what Republicans in Kansas were banking on when they tried to amend the Constitution there to repeal the right to abortion, they thought, well, it's a primary, no one's going to show up. And it turns out people did show up, and they showed up in force. And so, you know, democracy won the day. So I think, you know, what I'm going to be carefully watching, in addition to state legislatures, our city councils. Like, let's remember that the end of Roe began in Texas. That was the first state to implement a 6-week abortion ban, even before Roe was overturned. And it happened through this private bounty hunter enforcement mechanism where, you know, neighbors sue neighbors to enforce abortion bans. And that was pioneered at the city level. That was pioneered by ordinances passed in cities across Texas, from, you know, initiated by Markley Dixon, this activist who drove around to city council meetings in Texas, getting them to pass ordinances declaring abortion to be murder. I think that is sort of the most honest expression of where the anti-abortion movement is headed. And honestly, that's sort of the harbinger. We saw it first at the city level, then at the state level, and now we're, you know, beginning to understand much more deeply that the plan is a national ban. And just to end on a good news note, the fact that the cities and the states are the battleground, like, that can be a good thing too, right? So the New York City Council, in most recent victory, announced it was going to allocate $1 million in funding to support access to abortion. So there's lots of victories and being won at the state and city level as well.
Thank you, Amy. I thank you both for encapsulating a lot in a pretty short time. You know, I want us to set the stage with abortion post-Roe and where these battles are being fought, so we can find the corollaries when we're thinking about comprehensive sex ed. And in sort of continuing in that vein, you know, in the past several years, much of the national conversation when we talk about reproductive health care has been focused pretty acutely on abortion access. As we've watched the steady erosion of nonpartisanship in the Supreme Court and the rise to prominence of those in vocal opposition to abortion access, as you mentioned, Amy, the minority of Americans, right? But as a corollary, comprehensive sexuality education once loomed large in American discourse. I remember a time when CSE was making news on a daily basis and was a central struggle for robust reproductive rights in healthcare. So I'd like to hear from you, Jacqueline. What does the landscape of contestation around comprehensive sex ed look like today? What is the status of CSE in public schools nationwide? We know that the anti-abortion is a minority view of Americans, both religious and non. What do we know about the pervasiveness of anti-CSE sentiment and the mobilization among the U.S. population? Again, big question, so take your time with it, but really interested to hear.
Thanks. Yeah. And thanks to you for this forum and to my panelists for all the incredible work that they're doing and for setting the stage. I'll answer the good news question first. We know poll after poll, every poll shows that sex education in public schools is incredibly popular across the board throughout the country, bigger numbers than abortion. You'll get disagreement when you get down into talking about the younger grades, and that's something that we can talk about because actually some of what's taught in the younger grades is the most crucial in terms of preventing child abuse and other things. But across the board, in principle, Americans want quality sex education and relationships education taught in public schools, 80, 90%, depending on how you're slicing and dicing the public polling. Where that tends to fall down is that most people aren't prioritizing it as a political issue. So it's one thing to tell a poller, yeah, we should have that, but when they're going to vote, it's not on their mind. Candidates are not being asked by and large to take a stand on it in the last few years, but that's shifting now because the right has really focused in on it, right, as part of their attempts to destabilize our system of public education in this country, because their project is ultimately an anti-democratic project, and because public schooling is a huge pillar of democracy. And so we saw it start with sort of anti-masking and anti-vax at the school level, and then we saw the attacks on CRT, and now Christopher Rufo, who was of course the architect of the attacks on CRT, is explicitly trying to create controversy at school district levels about gender and sexuality education. So that includes the sort of don't say gay or trans type legislation that we saw in Florida, as well as, yes, absolutely, Koch-funded moral panic, 100%. As well as attacks on relationships and sexuality education. So it is an issue now whether or not we're ready for it. And mostly we are not ready for it. I can say that at Educate Us, we spent the summer, part of our summer, doing the first ever research that I could find on what moves people to action for public school sex education, as opposed to just public support polling. Like, do you support is a different question than will you vote for it as a sex ed candidate? Will you post about this on social media? Will you call your legislator about a bill? And we have learned a lot from that research. We're about to release a report on that, but I can give you a preview in our Speaking Up for Sex Education guide. The messages that we found that are successful are now in that guide. So there's a big chance to shift the narrative here. If I this isn't exactly what you asked, but I really want to make this pitch because I saw a question about it in the chat already. The big chance to shift the narrative is that on the left, we have mostly talked about sex education in ways that cede a lot of ground to the right, right? The messaging around sex education, even when it's on the table, when it's in the conversation, has been, oh, of course we don't want kids to have sex, but we should really do this so we can reduce teen pregnancy and HIV transmission, which can be a very re-stigmatizing message for kids who may be pregnant or have an STI. B, doesn't speak to parents because most parents think, oh, my kid is not going to have sex, and so I don't need to worry about those things. And C, the most important thing is we're missing out on the opportunity to make a bold argument for the social change that can come with universal public sex education, which is that it reduces child abuse, that it reduces bullying and harassment in schools. It makes kids more likely to stick up for each other if they see bullying and harassment. It reduces patriarchal beliefs and values, increases LGBTQ acceptance. It even increases academic performance, right? Like, this is a big, juicy social change public policy that we should really see as core to the progressive project. But instead, most of the time, we're repeating the rights framework with just a little tweak. And so we're losing on this issue right now, 100%, because there's a ton of money funding organizations like Moms for Liberty that are acting like they're grassroots spontaneous organizations, just moms showing up at school board meetings. And because we don't have the infrastructure right now on the left to show up when they're showing up, to know when they're showing up until the crisis has already spiraled out of control. That's something that Educate Us and other orgs are right now scrambling to figure out how to build that infrastructure. But I do believe that actually, because of the support public polling, that if we can get the left to care about this issue, if we can shift the salience on this issue, we'd actually make this a wedge issue for us. That's more than you asked.
No, that's excellent. I like that you also gave us a blueprint for moving forward, which is a through line I'd love to keep in this conversation. Combining sort of our last two mini conversations into one, I'd be interested to hear from all three of you the ways in which access to CSE, comprehensive sex education, and access to abortion are related, intertwined, mutually constitutive, not just in terms of sort of the right as an amorphous blob, but who on the right, funding on the right. Where is the sort of, you touched on this, Jacqueline, sort of what the narrative on the right is around CSE. Where is the interrelationship between the counterproductive ways that we as a society writ large talk about CSE? How does that relate to the way that the right has framed the issue of anti-abortion as well? And I'm also really interested in some of the infrastructure piece that all three of you touched on at this point, sort of the vast social movement that has brought us to this point in the anti-abortion movement. How can it be and how is it being mobilized against CSE? So who would like to take this question first? Go ahead, Cecilia.
Yeah, I can start. One thing that I want to mention, and just to echo what Jacqueline was saying before me, is that the anti-rights movement it has actually been doing a good job in connecting these different issues, and this is not that something we have done well on our side of the spectrum. We continue to work not only in the United States, but also internationally in silos. And I think that that's where the opposition has been very, very strong. And we see how they have basically bring in as their priorities, like attacking any progress related to abortion, comprehensive sexuality education, and science in general. And I also want to just mention how something that Jacqueline was mentioning about the how also they have been very good at the community level. It's like we've seen more and more anti-rights activists in the United States taking part of the school boards, the city councils, the different associations or organizations at the local level. While we, are too busy maybe with other spaces that in some way are not directly affecting the content, and also the way that the school system is basically ensuring that children and youth are going to have access to human rights based and gender transformative education. So I think that also with the changes that just happened, in terms of abortion, we can definitely see this as an increase on, or maybe a reduction on the access of information that adolescents are gonna have around abortion, or even how to access to an abortion service. Because of the increased stigma that can generate, or the fears even from teachers or other people in their communities to share information about abortion, especially in the states that are already increasing the restrictions and basically banning abortion at the state level. So I think that this is also a reminder on how much attention it requires, at the county level. What are we doing at the county level, where we know that basically they have a lot of influence on content, how the system is organized, what books children have access to, and other services, including access to evidence-based content, and or even other important programs and related to arts, or LGBTQ rights, etc. So I think that we really need to increase the awareness around this, so as a movement we are able to come together and also work at the local level.
Thank you, Cecilia. There's nothing the left loves more than a silo. And I appreciate the blueprint to move beyond that. Amy, you came off mute. Would you like to?
Yeah, I think that's so true what Cecilia said about the silos. And I'm even like seeing it emerging in this discussion where I'm hearing Jacqueline say sex education can be a wedge issue for the progressive or left side. And I'm like, wait a minute, I've literally made that same argument about abortion. Like, no, abortion is the wedge issue that's gonna like open the floodgates to, social justice for all. And like, it has to be a comprehensive vision of reproductive health and justice. Like somehow that has to be the wedge. And I think that's something that the left often struggles with, that because the right to access abortion has been in crisis basically since it was won in 1973, because we've been operating in a perpetual state of crisis. I think often there's been this defensive posture of, oh, we're losing, and a focus on abortion that has hindered the sort of proliferation of a comprehensive vision of bodily autonomy, which is not to say that vision doesn't exist, right? Reproductive justice gave us this framework many years ago and articulated a sweeping vision of economic and racial and sexual rights and justice. But has the Democratic Party always embraced that vision? Certainly not. Have the best funded organizations within the movement embrace that, vision? Not necessarily. Whereas I think Cecilia is right that if you look at what the other side is doing, I mean, I've been attending a lot of anti-abortion conversations and spaces leading up to and after the Dobbs decision. And at any anti-abortion event you go to these days, you're going to hear them talking about comprehensive sex education as like this scary bogeyman. You're going to hear them talking about critical race theory. You're going to hear them talking about a lot about gender ideology and transgender kids and that being a sort of next battleground. So they see no separation in those issues. They see it all as part of this, terrifying assault by the left. I mean, if only we are as powerful as they think we are. And so I think, I believe that the left is powerful, but I mean, in terms of like the amount of political capital, it's actually there, right? And so I think that's absolutely true, that the sort of defensive position that the abortion rights movement and the reproductive justice movement has been forced into, particularly because of a longstanding failure by Democratic leaders to really forcefully defend these rights and to see sex education and LGBTQ rights and abortion rights as winning political issues that they are, has sort of hindered the ability to articulate a sweeping vision that would be very popular and that might, open the door to a range of long overdue economic and racial and social justice reforms.
Thank you, Amy. I think we see a bit of a parallel there with the Green New Deal, right? Like, how do we present sort of platforms that are more holistic and maybe harder at first glance to take in, but much more compelling in the long run? I think that's absolutely the corollary for reproductive justice. Jacqueline, I saw that, so I want to hear your reaction to Amy.
I mean, I was actually going to say exactly what Amy just closed with, which is one thing that unfortunately the issues have in common is that Democrats are chickens on them and are refusing to make the argument. And that's how we got where we are on abortion, right? Abortion is a wedge issue that we could be using, but when we don't use it, it gets used against us. And sex ed is literally the same dynamics, right? That we're seeing right now in New Jersey. There's a whole frou-frou, I won't give you the whole history of it, where the right's flipping out about some standards that were improved 2 years ago, but are just being implemented now because of the pandemic. And the right the people flipping out of this are a clear minority in New Jersey. But the Democratic leadership is absolutely running scared from this issue instead of looking around the room and counting and saying like, yeah, we stand behind these standards. These standards are good and they're based in evidence and policy. And kids in New Jersey deserve a great education. There's great effective messaging they could be using, but they're running scared. I do think that's in part because we're still run by a white patriarchy in this country, and that this issue genuinely makes some of the men in power kind of squeamish. I don't think that they in their guts want to fight for it. So that is, yeah, but honestly, they would be reelected. They would be reelected if they fought for this. There's so much energy behind these issues. People would cheer, but they're afraid and they don't believe it in their own guts. And I would also say that, you know, one of the things I say about the connections between abortion and sex education is that just to think about what if all the Supreme Court justices had a good sex education, would they, like, they wouldn't have made, they would understand how our bodies work, for God's sake, right? That and the right understands that, right? The right has understood sex education as socially transformative for decades, which is why they have worked so hard to fund abstinence propaganda instead of sex education in public schools. And so it really is a question of us catching up on sort of the power of this issue and really putting our whole foot in it.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think, you know, you've all really touched on sort of the intersectionality at stake with CSE and abortion access. And I wanted to give us a minute to stick with sort of the discourse, both on the left and on the right, thinking a little bit about what is currently meant by CSE, comprehensive sex ed, and the opportunities that exist to make these connections stronger between racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, sort of reproductive justice, which encompasses all writ large, within comprehensive sex ed. Jacqueline, can you tell us a little bit about the status quo of comprehensive sex ed in the U.S. and in areas for improvement, you know, rather than assume it is, you know, ready to go and be deployed and used as a wedge issue and applied, are there areas for improvement?
I mean, of course there are, absolutely. I will say you'll notice that I don't use the term comprehensive sex ed, although it is a term of art understood inside the field. And I do that because Planned Parenthood found in a 2017 study that if you modify sex education with literally anything, it's less popular than if you just say sex education. I tend to say relationships and sexuality education so people understand it's bigger than just literally sex, because I think that's part of our issue. But I don't modify it with comprehensive because I also think comprehensive, and this is just me, sometimes makes people who don't understand the issue freak out and think like, oh, we're going to be real comprehensive with our sex ed. We're going to talk about all the stuff with your kindergartner. So it's fine for folks to use CSE, but I also wanted to share why you won't hear me using it unless I slip up, because it's a habit that's hard to break. So state-of-the-art relationships and sexuality education in public schools, the sex ed standards that are put out by SCOTUS, really are broke down into three basic buckets. So there's the elementary school curriculum, there's a middle school curriculum, and there's a high school curriculum. So many people are afraid to even say the word sex because we've had such terrible sex educations. We also have this generational problem that we need to break. Elementary school sex education is focused on bodies and boundaries, right? Like, this is your body. These are the names for their parts of your body. This is your rights to your body, but also everybody else's rights to their body. This is basic gender identity and sexual identity. So like, if there's stuff going on with your classmates and your friends and your parents, you understand what the basic vocabulary is. There's no actual sex in sex education in elementary school, which is part of the reason I say relationships also. It's about how to speak up if somebody's crossing your boundaries, right? And the basics of consent. In middle school, sex education looks like puberty education. What is going on with my body? And the beginning of actual sex education, right? But with an eye also to abuse prevention, and also starting to really build some healthy relationship skills and emotional literacy skills. And then in high school, you have a much more robust and frank discussion. Generally, the standards require that sex education be gender inclusive and inclusive of all LGBTQ identities and affirming of them, and that they teach about consent, that they teach about healthy relationships, that they teach about disease prevention and pregnancy prevention and all the stuff that we expect will be in there. But that really what we're talking about is teaching young people how to love and be loved and how to interact with their body and other people's bodies in healthy ways. I would say my number one wish list for how we could make that curriculum better across the board is to make there a more explicit racial and anti-racist analysis inside of it, and a much more robust conversation of how sexuality and sexual experiences and identities are different across racial lines because of racism. That is not something the right is going to want to hear. But if you're asking me how we could make it better, that's the top of my wish list.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That was a very comprehensive overlook of relationship and sexuality education. And I appreciate the note on language. It's, as we know, so important to politics. Cecilia, do you want to chime in here too?
Yeah, and I really appreciate what you were saying, because at the international level, there's also a lot of discussion around like comprehensive sexual education, and how there's a lot of resistance and also opposition to the term in different countries. And as I was mentioning before, like the opposition is really good at bringing together different issues that are highly stigmatized, like CSC, abortion, LGBTQ rights, HIV, etc. So I also think that this goes beyond what we know about CSC or what we know about sex ed. It is about like quality education in the United States, because I think like the attacks that have existed, for decades. This is not something new, but it's basically like focus on like critical race theory, CSC, just evidence-based science, like also like this idea that having an evidence-based education, it is like basically against like parental rights. It's like this is something that I see more and more happening, and basically where it is the understanding that parents are the ones who have to decide everything that is taught to kids, when we know that they should be exposed to a variety of like information, and also services and other resources that are needed during the different developmental stages. So I think that that's definitely something that is also important to continue to see how we also identified a better messaging around like parental rights, like also children and youth like autonomy, a lot of like the disinformation campaigns against like gender, CSC, critical race theory, that is not only on public schools, but it's like in general in the media. A lot of like the conservative media always are highlighting. So at the national level in the United States, there's always this understanding that all of these issues are bad, that it's like the left or like the progressive movements are trying to basically brainwash children and youth. So I think that this requires like broader also basically partnerships with across movements, because I think that we need to also think about it goes beyond CSC. It is against like education, it is against like rights, and obviously the most affected will be the Black, indigenous, communities of color that are always like affected, and that in a lot of cases like the public education system is their only option, and I think that something that and this is like the last thing I will comment right now, but it's like one of the things I keep seeing and that we have been tracking from IPAS is this campaign that exists around like homeschooling. And I think that the COVID, the pandemic also have pushed a lot of this narrative because obviously I think that parents could have that right to decide if they wanted to have their kids at home or not. Contexts are different for each family. But at the same time, I think that the argument is not based on like children's needs, because we know that children with disabilities or with different needs can actually do better in a context like homeschooling. But at the same time, this is not done in the benefit of the children. It is just to push their agenda, their content, and also to basically damage like the school system and reduce funding and also basically change the idea that we have in the United States, in terms of like the right to education and the obligation of the states to basically provide this right. We know that in the United States we don't have universal access to healthcare, and I'm afraid that that's exactly what they're trying to do with education. That this is not going to be something that it will be protected anymore at the state level, and we know that we have huge risk. One, because something that Amy and Jacqueline have said is like the Democratic Party is not strong enough. They're not our best allies. I sometimes even doubt that they are on our side. And also they we also have to have in mind it's like the political context and the Supreme Court also represents a huge risk for education in general.
Thank you, Cecilia. I appreciate you bringing homeschooling up in the conversation too, as yet another front against public education. Jacqueline, would you like to?
Yeah, I just want to echo and expand on a couple of things that Cecilia brought up. First of all, they are not shy about the fact that they want to end the universal right to public education. Abbott, right after the Dobbs decision leaked, told, I forget what newspaper or outlet, that he would like to challenge Plyler, which is the 1982 Supreme Court decision that established that public schools have to educate everyone, including undocumented students. So they're going to use undocumented students as a wedge to begin to unravel the public school system writ large. You hear Fox News commentators these days calling them not public schools, but government schools. That's the new rhetoric, because of course, government is suspect on the right. And so it sounds like a handout when you say government schools. So be on the lookout for that rhetoric. But I've heard numerous right-wing commentators say like, we should reevaluate whether we actually want public education, which is code for we don't. And like I said, Abbott has come out and said that he doesn't want it, that he's going to challenge Plyler. So that's coming. I think it's coming sooner than anybody's prepared for. And that keeps me up at night for real. I will say on the parents' rights tip that the most effective two messages we found in our research this summer was the number one across the board against opposition messages. We tested against a parents' rights opposition message and a groomer attack opposition message. And the one that really neutralizes and in some cases does better than neutralize both of those attacks is a majority rights message, which is most parents actually want this education for their students. And then we characterize our opposition and we talk about unity and for getting our students what they need. Because the reality is they don't have the numbers. They have the money, but they don't have the numbers. And when we talk about parents' rights, we need to make sure to bring to the fore that we really want to prioritize parents. We actually need to support this kind of education in school, as well as fight back book bans and attacks on CRT and trans kids playing sports and all of that stuff. And the other message that rose to the fore, also from what Cecilia brought up, was one about student representation and how young people deserve to see themselves reflected in their own curriculum. So those are resonant messages, right? Like we should not be afraid to say those with our full throat. And they do undermine opposition attacks. We are seeing, though, I saw a question about transparency, which is sort of an offshoot of the parents' rights strategy on the right. Those transparency calls are very effective, and we're in fact seeing public schools being buried in FOIAs right now about all manner of things, from what's in the library and how it gets selected to curricula to all manner of things. And again, the idea ultimately is to make the school not tenable, right? The fact that it makes it hard to run that school is the purpose. And I just was on a call with some Michigan organizers this morning who said that we should be looking out for that they've started to file FOIAs about what's permissible on the internet in public libraries, or about whether that's, I don't know, but that we should expect attacks on what students can use the internet for inside public schools as well. So they're coming for public schools from every angle.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think now all of us will be staying up at night.
Sorry.
Amy, go ahead.
Was anyone here not already up at night? It's just me. Yeah, I mean, first, just side note, Jacqueline, as you were talking about what sex education looks like, and I'll stop calling it comprehensive sex education. Thank you for that. I was like thinking about how, even though I went to public school in Massachusetts, what I thought was like pretty good, how far away my sex education was from that. Like, I can remember my gym teacher in high school making us copy down all of the symptoms of all of the STDs. Like, that was our class. It's like fear mongering, right? And so I think one of the things I was thinking about as both Cecilia and Jacqueline were talking is how much basic information is a battleground in our current moment. And I talk a lot to abortion rights organizers, to people who are part of abortion funds, to people who are doing the nitty-gritty work of just getting people to abortion care in this moment, which is often like a very unglamorous and highly logistical operation. But like, one of the hardest parts of their job right now is just helping people understand what the facts are. Like, is abortion legal in your state or not? Where can you get an abortion? What is contraception? It's not an abortion. How does contraception work? How does an abortion work? Like, people don't understand that basic information. And that means that in this environment of infringement on bodily autonomy and reproductive rights, they're even more impaired from making meaningful decisions and seeking out information. Like, we just don't know how many people are not even seeking abortion because they assume there's a nationwide ban, right? Like some huge number of people just thought that the Supreme Court decision meant abortion's now illegal. And partly that's on the media and how we cover it, right? And I'll take partial responsibility for that. On the other hand, like, the media and coverage of this state bans abortion, here's the next crisis, like, that's not the appropriate place for people to learn basic information about how their body works and where they can seek out basic healthcare in their state. So yeah, I mean, it's just something I hear repeated over and over again from abortion rights activists. And another piece I wanted to add on that parental rights component is just how much the anti-abortion playbook, which is like really old and not that innovative, is just being copy pasted into all of these other areas, right? Where did the incremental creep against abortion rights start, right? I mean, first of all, with public funding, with poor women, with the Hyde Amendment, which banned federal funding of abortion, which affected Medicaid recipients, most of them women of color, right? And with this idea of parental rights and the idea that parents should be able to reject the right of their children to seek an abortion, and this false idea that, minors couldn't make those choices for themselves. And, someone can be old enough and mature enough to, give birth, but not to make that decision about whether to seek an abortion. I mean, that's an incredibly powerful tool that the anti-abortion movement used. And so it's being replicated again in these other areas, whether it's, sex education, or, the right of your children not to be indoctrinated on, the fact that there's racial injustice in this country. Like, it's just, I think we're going to see that more and more of the anti-abortion movement, successful, highly successful tactics being replicated across all of these different areas.
Thank you, Amy. It's, I think it's really helpful to think about the ways in which the right does deploy the same strategies again and again. You've also all given us a lot of strategies in terms of language, in terms of reframing sort of basic ideas and focusing on science and understanding as much as policy areas. I want to transition us into continuing this conversation, or I guess not transitioning, continuing the conversation with strategies that you all are seeing, but also examples of coalition building and agenda alignment that you're working on in your work and that you're seeing on the left. We do know that the tendency on the left is to siloize, and that the tendency on the right has been to do the opposite, and I think it's part and parcel of why we're in this moment that we are today. But there are still coalitions in development, in formation, and operation. So I'd love for us to touch on what you're seeing in the field, and in the course of that reflection, sort of strategies that you're seeing as being particularly effective right now. Any first takers?
I mean, I'm on coalition calls all the time, and so is everybody at SCOTUS, and we have a meeting every other week to coordinate all the coalitions that we're on and to share the information between them. So I do want folks to know that it's not completely silos. We're working with Equality Federation and folks in LGBTQ rights movement. We're working with the Learn from History Coalition, which is mobilized originally to push back against attacks on CRT, and now is sort of more broadly about curriculum censorship. We're working with the Survivors Agenda. We're certainly on a lot of calls with folks who work in repro. I should say, I don't think I said this in the beginning, but Educate Us, the C4 that I run, is less than a year old. We launched last November, so we're the new kid on the block. But so is almost everybody when it comes to organizing school boards and school board elections. And so I'm also in a new set of meetings of organizations that are trying to get involved in school board elections. So there's a lot of coalition work happening. There's not a lot of resources, right? There's a ton of great creative ideas getting floated, and not enough funding. I was just on a call today with the Michigan Coalition around attacks on K-12 education writ large, and I was talking to somebody afterwards from Michigan Education Justice Alliance, I think is what they're called, and she has this incredible idea to hire somebody who knows how to win school board elections to literally coach all the candidates all the progressive candidates in Michigan that she has still not been able to get funding for. Like, we don't have, somebody should fund that, man. Like, I'm gonna try and help her find funding, because I also want to learn how that works so that we can pilot it in other places around the country. So from where I sit, the issue is not that people want to be in silos or feel stuck in silos, but that the really creative and necessary infrastructure work that we want to build as coalitions, we do not have adequate funding for.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. I think that's, a reality that we are often contending with, and it's a major reason why we need to move impetus from sort of center-left liberalism to actual left justice, because that's where the money is, right? Cecilia, you wanted to come to...
Yeah, no, I agree with Jacqueline. It's like I know I passionately talk about the silos because it's like the reality is that the limited funding, the limited staff of NGOs, organizations, working on this, and the competing priorities, and the need of like reacting to a lot of like the attacks that come from different angles, from the anti-rights movement and politicians. It's a challenge. I personally think like we need a more support at the higher level too in the United States. I know that I have been talking about like the need of like local county level, city level strategies, but at the same time, I think that we need to start changing the narratives around like not only abortion, but also about not only about sex ed, but also about like the right to education in the United States. Because it's like that is it is not only important obviously for the individual lives of children and youth, but also for the future of this country. That's like, we know the impact that student loans has on like youth ability to be able to secure housing, to be able to have a better job, or even like make their own reproductive rights health decisions. So we know that losing the right to education in this country is going to mean like even more discrimination, more like gaps, more inequity, more racism, etc. Because we know that not like a good portion of this country is not going to be able to afford a private education or have access to education in general. So I think that we need to open that conversation beyond the progressive movements. It is like also that even like the private sector, that I know that from the civil society organizations, we usually don't know how to work with them, and but we also have to hold them accountable of a lot of like these big corporations that have been talking about like supporting racial rights or supporting like reproductive justice or reproductive rights, etc. So we need to also come up with like a specific points that we also or like asks that we had to bring to them and to the governments, at the local and also state and federal level.
Thank you, Cecilia. I really appreciate the emphasis on having corporations put their money where their mouth is. I think that's it. Especially when we have this more intersectional understanding, it becomes easier to do that. Amy, I want to come to you to talk about journalism very quickly. Jacqueline, I think you had one more strategy to share with us.
Sorry, I got all worked up about funding streams and forgot to talk about something that we know actually works, which is deep canvassing. So we have actually just secured funding to create the first ever deep canvassing script for persuasion on the issue of sex education. And we're going to be running that pilot this winter to develop that strategy. For those that don't know, deep canvassing was developed during the marriage equality fight and has been used in all kinds of campaigns and policy fights. In 2020, it was found to be 101 times more effective than traditional canvassing. It's really incredible. And what it basically means is you're having much slower, more in-depth conversations with the people you're canvassing, and you're inviting them to almost self-persuade, to discover what the issue really resonates about with them, and to help them move through whatever fear and resistance that they have by making a deep personal connection. And it also shows that the persuasion that happens in deep canvassing lasts 9 months or longer, which is just absolutely incredible. Yeah, Arkansas, it's really an incredible tool. I came to it in 2018 here in Massachusetts. There was a ballot measure attempting to roll back protections for trans people accessing public accommodations. And we did a particular kind of deep canvassing called inoculation, where you show opposition messages to people and then help them move through it. So we would go to the doors and say, here's an ad that says trans people are going to rape your kids in the bathroom, and like, how do you feel? And I was like, what? But it's just incredibly powerful. And because it's been developed on issues around sex and gender, think it shows great promise around the issue of sex education.
Yeah, if there's a magic spell for the left, it's deep canvassing. Amy, you were gonna jump in here too, and then I'll come to you, Cecilia.
Oh, wow. I love that. I want to find out all of the things about that campaign, Jacqueline. I was just going to shout out one other example of coalition building in this area that I think is really exciting, which is the intersection between the labor movement and the reproductive health rights and justice movement. We're in this like beautiful heyday of labor organizing right now after a long period of deunionization. I mean, Starbucks, Amazon, and Planned Parenthood and even independent clinics are in that mix. And so I think there's a huge push by these workers to call upon the labor movement to support them in this moment, to understand that these are jobs, these are union jobs. Come stand with us, come help defend us. If the clinic's under threat, stand with us the same way you would with your union brothers and sisters in any other industry. And what is so exciting about these unions is that the workers within them are really addressing some of those structural issues that Cecilia was talking about. They are calling out the nonprofit industrial complex and the fact that there's a handful of billionaires who fund this work and that they can withdraw their funding on a whim if the foundation changes its program officer or its priorities. They're calling out the fact that this work is underfunded and not sustainable for the workers. And they're calling out often the missions and saying, we need to have racial justice and economic justice and LGBTQ rights at the core of our mission, and we're going to bring those issues to the bargaining table. And so I think that intersection is really encouraging and exciting.
Thank you, Amy. It's always, I feel like in this moment, really helpful to think about labor as a major source of possibility. Cecilia?
Yeah, no, and thank you, Amy, for that example. I think it's very, inspiring when we can feel sometimes like very challenged and negative, in terms of like all the attacks that our work suffers, every single day. But I want to like mention two things. One, it is the importance of promoting also youth leadership and engagement. This is something obviously we have seen with the, I don't know if they still have the name, but the gay and lesbian alliance, I think, in schools have been an example in the United States. But also we have seen, across the world, the work that the Fridays, for climate have done. It's like basically making visible like the leadership that adolescents and youth have, related to climate and social justice and economic justice. So I think that we need more of that across the country to make sure that youth voices are also going to be heard, because as we were talking about, like parents really want their kids to have this information. Children and youth also want to have information and education about these issues. So I think like organizations should definitely take ensure that youth engagement and participation and leadership is a priority. The other thing that I want to talk about is like, some of the strategies that definitely work. And I also want to echo what Amy was saying about like the coalition building. And in that sense, like, I just briefly want to mention a resource that we actually created at IPAS about like, advocating for abortion and CSC. And, this is obviously on abortion because that's basically the work that we do. But at the same time, it's a tool that can be adapted, for education in general, and also for other areas that are critical, in this context. And the other thing is about the deep canvassing, and I love that idea. I have seen also some organizations in North Carolina doing that after the SCOTUS decision, and I think it is crucial to support this type of initiatives. But that made me to think about like the work that IPAS has been doing on values clarification. And I know different organizations also do that on abortion and other topics in the United States. But I think that is a very powerful tool to also bring awareness on different issues and intersections, between like climate justice, reproductive justice, racial justice, economic justice. So, most of the people, including ourselves, it's like we were sharing already examples on like how bad it's sexual education was or have been for us. So it's like community members, different stakeholders, everyone, they have gone through the same thing. So I think that values clarification can be a powerful tool for different people to really understand what are like the needs of children and youth in the school system, and also the ones that are out of the school system. So we also start rethinking about like some of the harmful, cultural norms, gender norms that we have in this country. So I think that those are some concrete examples that maybe are useful.
Yeah, thank you. I think all three of you gave us a lot of very concrete strategies. If you have resources, we can absolutely distribute them to this audience, actually to the PRA full list, with the recording and the transcript of this conversation. But it's, I won't say rare, but there are fewer moments in the day where we actually get to think very strategically about what can be done in very concrete steps in ways that are also really encouraging. It also sounds like IPAS and SCOTUS need a joint TikTok so we can galvanize our political youth. In closing the conversation today, I want to stay with the positive sort of view for future action that you all have brought us to right now. But I want to know personally, what keeps you going in this work? What brings you your resolve? What brings you joy? What fuels you? What helps you fall back asleep in the middle of the night?
I can start. I'm coming off of a high from covering the referendum in Kansas, where, this issue of should we remove the right to abortion from the state constitution was put before voters because of the crafty way that Republicans put it out there, scheduling it for a primary when there were more exciting Republican contests, knowing that unaffiliated voters, who are about 30% of Kansas voters, were likely not going to show up to a primary. They stacked the deck, and this was expected to win easily. And there was a huge surge in organizing from people who have not been political before, people who have been quietly pro-choice, who are suddenly angrily, rabidly, actively pro-choice, Republican women who were like, oh, no, yeah, this is not happening. I just an enormous amount of energy and momentum. I think there's something much more significant than a blue wave. Everyone's focused on the midterms right now. I think there's something much more deep and sustained and slow going than a blue wave that's forming right now. And that is the awakening of the majority of people who support reproductive health, rights, and justice, whether we're talking about comprehensive sex education or abortion. There is an enormous groundswell happening right now. I think we're starting to see that in some of the voter registration numbers among women in battleground states like Pennsylvania. But I think it would be a mistake to look just at the outcome of the midterms, because we know Democrats have not always been the best champions of these issues, and it's not the same as a straight up and down referendum, whether a Democrat is able to win an election. So I just would encourage people to keep their eye on the big picture and on the groundswell that I really think is beginning.
Thank you, Amy. Jacqueline, Cecilia, what's keeping you going?
I totally agree with Amy. I would say in the last few months, I've become actually encouraged and hopeful. But I think that in the times when I don't feel that as an emotion, I really rely on Rebecca Solnit's writing in the book Hope in the Dark, and that has really reoriented my approach to hope, right? That I don't wait to feel hopeful. It's nice when I feel hopeful. I do actually feel hopeful right now for reasons that Amy described, but that hope primarily is not an emotion, it's an attitude, it's a stance. And that if we act as though there is no hope, then we will be right. And if we act as though there is hope for change, for the kinds of changes that we desperately need and deserve, then we can sometimes produce that hope. Look at Kansas, right? Like, they didn't all stay home and say, oh, well, it's a red state, why fight this, right? They acted as if, and they made it so. And so that is where I live most of the time, which is just like, it's not my business whether I feel hopeful or not. It's my business about how I can produce hope today.
Thank you. So when I'm from Nicaragua, so I have seen it all. We are under a dictatorship, and also I personally cannot even go back to my country. So, when I moved to the United States, in North Carolina, there were a referendum about the First Amendment to the North Carolina Constitution, that it was about defining marriage only between a man and a woman. And when I moved here, I was like very in shock that was even into consideration. Because obviously it's not that I was like ignorant of the U.S. politics and weakness in terms of like human rights, but at the same time, I was expecting that I will see a more progressive policies and politics. So it's like just my experience, like working internationally, and also seeing like how under threat the rights are in the United States, and what can happen when sexual and reproductive health and rights are under attack. It basically made me feel the urgency of like, we really need to do something, because I have seen how women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights are negotiated just as a political card, as an electoral strategy. And after that, we're following like with or democracy or human rights in general. So I think that just coming from Nicaragua, that makes me basically very committed to democracy in this country, because I know what can happen, in a very short period of time. So we had to stay vigilant.
Thank you, Cecilia, Jacqueline, Amy. I think we can definitely galvanize hope. I think we can absolutely act with urgency, and then celebrate win political awakenings. There is a lot here that can keep us going, and does, including conversations like this one. So I want to really thank the three of you for taking your time to talk with us today. I really look forward to gathering resources so that we can distribute to our audiences, and I know we're in coalition with some of the organizations that we've touched on today, but more coalitional work, the better. Just again, thank you. This has been a fabulous conversation. We've covered a lot of ground in not too long, so hopefully we'll be able to do it again.